I would like to thank Andreas for his generous introduction. And I have to tell you once again how happy I am to be here and how energized I feel. I've been feeling since I got here. Thanks in huge part for the quality of the conversations we have been able to weave, both formally and informally. So tonight, I would like to invite you to join me in an exercise in utopian thinking. Utopian thinking of the kind Ernst Bloch undertook in his Spirit of Utopia, or for that matter, in his the Hope Principle. The kind of critical utopianism we also find in Kant's considerations on what he called perpetual peace. If you were to go back to Kant's text on perpetual peace, you will notice that he spends some time thinking about the idea of hospitality. In his mind, to extend hospitality to a stranger meaning one who is not of us, but who happens, willingly or not, to knock at our door or to find himself or herself in our midst. So to extend hospitality to a stranger wasn't for him a matter of charity or philanthropy. And in fact, he said it as clearly as possible. It was not the effect of feeling pity for those who suffer, or feeling empathy, since the term has resurfaced a lot, especially in the 90s, in this age of humanitarianism. So hospitality had nothing to do, in Kant's view, nothing to do with humanitarianism. Hospitality was an intrinsic aspect of what we can call Kantian law. And we're speaking about law, which presupposes somewhere another concept of rights, insofar as the law, properly understood, has to do with matters of justice and matters of rights, and not matters of pity or empathy. So hospitality in Kant's mind was one of those rights each and every single human being could claim in virtue of his or her being a human being, and nothing else. Not in virtue of him or her being German or Cameroonian or South African or black or white or Chinese. Which means that in the mind of Kant, there was some foundational, originary connection on the basis of which humanity at large could make a set of claims. Now, to put it even more precisely, in Kantian law, hospitality refers to, and I quote him now, the a stranger who arrives in other people's land or soil to not be treated as an enemy by the later. So this question of enmity, that is the first thing Kant introduces in this debate on hospitality. But Kant's position is complex. And reading it very carefully, it clearly appears that it's not without tensions. So let me now move a bit deeper into this and elicit some of those tensions, all of which, if you ask me, are particularly productive. Now, what happens when a stranger exercises the right to knock at the door? At not his own door, because normally, your own door, you open it. You don't knock, okay, I arrive home in the evening and I knock and then I expect someone to answer. So the right to knock at the door, which, by the way, these days is more and more we are witnessing in our world right now the destruction of that Kantian right to knock at the door. The reasons, we'll talk about them later. But the idea that I can knock at the door and I have to expect an answer. That knocking at the door is a form of address. Whoever is behind the door has to respond. You do not have the right to not respond. All of that in virtue, you see, I'm now... Kant is taking possession of me, but I will make sure that I stay within my own limits and let Kant do whatever he wants. So the point, when we read him, the point is that you have to answer. But these days, we know very well what's going on. We don't want to see, we don't want to hear, we don't want to listen to the Kantian law, the call, the injunction to respond. We prefer indifference. We oppose the law of indifference. And the law of ignorance and prejudice, because ignorance, prejudice, allow us to do things we wouldn't be able to do if we were to listen, if we were to hear, and if we were to have the courage to answer. Because what is at stake in the injunction to answer are questions of responsibility, not only vis-a-vis ourselves, but vis-a-vis the human race, not vis-a-vis our national co-citizens, vis-a-vis the human race, vis-a-vis the earth, and we'll talk about the earth because Kant has a few words about it too, matters of responsibility and matters of justice, of universal justice. So, but Kant, as you know, he's a very careful thinker. He says, the stranger who knocks at my door, I might choose to not welcome him or her. And I have that right. I have the right to say, you know what, you are not welcome here. So do you mind please proceeding and go and knocking at someone else's door? I won't open mine. But there's a but here. He or she might not be welcomed by the native, insofar as this does not lead to the loss of the stranger's life. Now, if by saying no, you are not welcome, I expose the stranger to unwanted death, I put in peril his or her life, then I cannot say no. That's what he's saying. Can't. I have the duty to say yes. Come in. I cannot say no under certain circumstances in which the life of another human being is at stake. Which means that my life, the value of my life, is originally implicated in the life of all other human beings. And wherever another human being's life is in peril, mine is automatically engaged in that peril. So, a foundational principle of mutuality of human lives, which makes all of us responsible for each and every single life that is at stake and that is under threat. It doesn't matter where, and it's even more so if it is under threat in front of our own eyes, at hearing distance from the cry that comes from the person in danger. But as you know very well, as we speak, that is not what is going on. And therefore, we are very far from Kant. Reason why I thought that tonight we should engage in some exercise in critical utopianism. Kant goes on to argue that as long as the stranger, and I quote him again, peacefully remains in his or her place, a place he does not go on defining at length, he or she must not be treated in any hostile way. So you see, he's very worried about the fact that, about the question of hostility, of mistreating people, the other human being, or being hostile to the other human being for no reason. Now, he introduces even more nuances in the argument. What the stranger is claiming, the claim he or she is allowed to make, is not a right to hospitality. And I would like you to keep that nuance in mind. He seems to be saying that none of us has an automatic right to hospitality. He seems to reserve the right to hospitality to the members of the community only. That is, the community of those who have chosen freely to abide by a contract. We imagine, maybe in our modern language, to citizens of a nation. So if I'm not a citizen of the nation, he seems to be saying I don't have the right to hospitality. All that I have is the right to knock at the door. Nowadays, in the world we live in, the right to knock at the door is being dismantled through all that is happening to the question of asylum. The claim the stranger is entitled to is a claim to visit. So, the distinction between hospitality and the right to visit. A distinction between the bundle of rights exclusively reserved to those he called the inhabitants, and the types of rights non-inhabitants can legitimately claim. So the right to visit is a right each and every human is entitled to. What is this right? It is the right to propose to become a member of any political community. Now, I can come here, or you can come to South Africa and ask to become part of that community South Africans have constituted. You have that right, and it can't be taken away from you by virtue of your being a human being like any other. So you can apply to become a citizen. It's a fundamental human right, argues Kant. But it's also a right he or she, the stranger, is entitled to in virtue, I quote him, of our common possession of the earth. Now, see, he's dealing with, I'm sure that in the evening, and then so we inhabit this, in fact, small part of the cosmos, which is our planet. Our planet is very small, finally. And it's becoming smaller and smaller. So he wonders, but to whom belong? To whom does it belong? And his response is that we exercise common possession of the earth. And by exercising common possession of the earth, this entitles each and every one of us to a set of protections and rights, I repeat the term, which are ineradicable, which cannot be taken away from us. Nobody can oppose a fin de non-recevoir if we make a claim on that basis. And this question of the common possession of the earth is the question of the 21st century. As the impending ecological catastrophe looms harder and harder, from a critical utopian point of view, we have to bring it back to debates on the future of life, and for that matter, on the future of reason, because the two are the pillars which have helped the human race so far to avoid its own suicide. I could go on and on Kant. I mean, I like Kant a lot, although I don't like him that much when I read his anthropology of what is that, Le Beau, his aesthetic theory. Because the Kant whom I shared with you, I mean, snipers, I can see your faces, and some of you are touched by what he's saying. Others are rather skeptical, but I mean, that's in the nature of these kinds of discussions. So, this is the good Kant, but it's a terrible Kant. When the Kant who writes about the feeling of the beautiful, and who's a vulgar racist, I have to tell you. I mean, he loses it. He just loses it. You can't recognize the rational philosopher, methodical, disciplined, especially when he's dealing with Africa and Africans. I mean, he doesn't call them Africans. You know how he calls them. So he loses reason, which means that the stranger is dangerous, not in the sense we think. The stranger is, now I'm extrapolating on Kant, that figure that threatens us with an unreason. When we see that figure, if we are not careful, we are likely to lose reason. And that is part of what is going on today. That in relation to matters of so-called migration, refugees, we are threatened by unreason. And therefore, the injunction is to rehabilitate reason when it comes to such matters. Let me move on then, and now make a different kind of argument. That was the first set of comments I wanted to introduce to tonight's debate. The second set of comments has to do with, if we open our eyes, if we reanimate all our senses, which are at the same time faculties, the capacity to see, to smell, to touch, to taste. When we open all of that to the kind of vital energies Kant is arguing for the protection of human life, it doesn't matter its origins or its texture. If we pause a little bit and open our senses, what is it that we'll see? We will see all over the world, as we speak, people, multitudes, one has to say, attempting to cross all kinds of borders. We will see other multitudes incarcerated in as many prisons as we can imagine. There have never been as many human beings in prisons throughout our world as they are today. In America alone, black people form 12% of the entire population. But when you go into those prisons, they represent 50% of the millions of prisoners America is holding in its public and more private prisons. The linkage between the business of incarceration and the business of making profit. Just as in the time of slavery, when business, profit, was intrinsically attached to the black body. And indeed, this is part of what I try to explain in that book. During global capitalism's long ascent, by which I mean from the 16th, 17th century in particular to the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, because that's when this system we live in, which we are told is the only one, that there's no alternative, that is the historical moment when this system ascends and becomes the undisputed force it is today. At a colossal price, of course. During that long ascent, workers of all kinds, slaves, of course, indentured servants, convicts, domestic workers, soldiers, sailors, they repeatedly run away from their masters. Capitalism, as you know, required vast numbers of mobile workers who would build the foundations of a new economic order. As a number of historians have shown, the establishment of European empires in particular And the rise of capitalism around the globe, its universalization, if you want, was a Herculean task. It required, of course, the production of commodities for trade, such as sugar, tobacco, spices. It required the movement of riverine boats, transoceanic vessels, connecting ports with vast hinterlands, the maintenance of factories and forts, military labor to safeguard imperial possessions, workers from America, from Africa, from Asia, Europe. But at the heart of this new imperial and capitalist order laid the vexed issue of mobility. Either forced mobility, as in the case of African slaves or indentured servants, or those forms of mobility that emerged out of these multitudes' attempt at running away from their masters. These were the two dominant forms of mobility insofar as they related to subaltern classes. Of course, other people went to talk about America as such. They went there more or less freely. They didn't arrive in America in chains, but we arrived there in chains. And since then, from an African diasporic perspective, the question of freedom has to do with, first of all, the freedom to move freely, unchained. So when you look into our pure political, religious to begin with, in fact, tradition, redemption from captivity is akin to conquering the right to move freely. So mobility is at the foundation of our idea of what human emancipation is all about. Because even the kind of alienation Marx speaks about in his analysis of capital, its privileged side of instantiation is indeed to be the fact of being assigned to a place one cannot move away from. Or if one moves away from it, it's only to go from the plantation to the prison. As the American example I quoted refers to. The same thing under colonialism in Africa. Before colonialism, there were no borders as such in sub-Saharan Africa in any case. Or if borders existed, their function was to render passage possible. The reverse of what modern borders, the function they fulfill. That the border, the business of the border, is to connect people, rather than to categorize people, select them, and write them into systems which emphasize their differences as possibly opposite species. So the struggle over mobility, that is what it meant then. Today then, people have been attempting to cross, since I speak about this because we are in Europe. If we were in South Africa, I would take my examples from South Africa. Because when I say borders and all of that, it's not simply in relation to Europe. It's also in relation to where I come from, South Africa. But since we are here in Europe, let's talk about Europe. Over the last decade, the EU southern borders, namely the external borders of Greece Italy, Malta, and Gibraltar, they have become known as sites of an escalating number of, let's just call them border deaths. 34,000, if you need the latest figures. These deaths are the result of the severity of the risks border crossers have taken. And we'll talk about this later on. If you ask me, as far as Africa is concerned, I believe that there is no reason whatsoever for any African person to die trying to cross the borders of Europe. Objectively, there are no reasons. Or ideally, there shouldn't be any reason. There shouldn't be any reason whatsoever, if only because we have a colossal continent. We have a colossal continent which is arguably the last piece of earth that is still capable to sustain over a long term human life. But it is a piece of the earth that is saddled by myriads of borders inherited from colonialism. Because that's what colonialism did. It saddled the continent with multiple borders, which have been internalized, which have become rents, in the sense that elites and other social classes have invested a lot in maintaining them, not getting rid of them, because they make huge profits out of their regulation. They control and regulation, they have captured the borders and turned them into rents. Which means that in order to make it such that no African person dies trying to cross the borders of a part of the world where they are not invited, they are not welcomed, they know nobody, or more or less, in order to put an end to that, we have no choice but to open Africa to herself. To turn the African continent into a vast space of circulation, both for her people and for humanity at large, so that those who want to tie their fate with the fate of Africa might be able to do so in the spirit of Kant. But there's a long way to get there. But if there is a major injunction in this century, before the continent becomes the place where you find, by the end of this century, the biggest number of people, because our demographic transition hasn't happened yet. It will happen by 2060, 2065, according to demographers. By the end of the century, Africa will have recovered the loss it suffered during the 4 centuries of the slave trade. There you will find the bulk of young people on earth, which will be very different from here, in the sense that our world will be divided between the old world, properly speaking, and a younger world. So the only way to do that is to open the continent to itself and turn it into a vast space of circulation. That is not the case so far. That's why, indeed, you have a number of Africans dying trying to cross the Mediterranean, being dumped in the Sahara Desert, or sold in new slave markets in places such as Libya. And these policies are funded, devised, and supported by Europe. So we have to interrogate Europe from a Kantian perspective on its responsibility. Europe is not alone, but it is partly and to a large extent responsible for a lot of what is going on matters of human mobility in this age. And indeed, that's where things are going. The intensified securitization of migration policies and border enforcement. More and more, through a number of technologies, and I would just like to mention 4 of them to show you the extent to which those technologies which presume to be neutral are in fact becoming technologies of racialization. How racism is now operating through abstractions, technological abstractions, most of which are supposed to govern our world and our conduct as we move further into the century. So what are those 4 technologies? The first are the technologies of biometric inscription. That's how they are called. These are technologies that are centered on biometric detection and datification of bodily features. They range from the digital fingerprints that make up, in fact, the European Union Eurodac database. Europe has constituted this massive database of fingerprints. So from digital fingerprints to the DNA testing, which is imposed in a racial manner on migrant families of specific racialized backgrounds. They are not imposed on everybody. They are imposed on very specifically selected racial groups and implemented as such. These technologies of biometric inscription include other things such as iris scans, but also facial recognition technologies. The goal here being to read data of the bodies of people on the move, to convert embodied indexes such as skin, already mentioned fingerprints, facial traits, retinas, irises, DNA, to convert all of that into what is technically known as data doubles, which are then stored in networked bases in order to profile, to track, and to surveil mobile individuals. That is part of what is going on. And we owe it to ourselves as citizens to know about it and to not turn the eye or the ear when this is brought to us. The injunction, the Kantian injunction, to respond, standing, of course. You have to stand and answer. The second cluster, technological cluster, which is being developed and amplified, intensified as we speak, has to do with new algorithmic modes of sensing and tracking movements. This set of technologies range from ground sensors that carry out surface crossing detections. It includes radars, infrared and thermal imaging. It also includes emerging tools such as geolocation, tracking and gesture and gait recognition softwares, which focus on the more intimate scale of individual bodily movements and gestures for profiling purposes. So profiling is the nature of the game right now. Profiling what? Profiling racialized bodies. The third cluster of technological cluster has to do, I think, with the introduction of newer forms of mobile military surveillance into practices of border control. And here, I have to say one thing. The idea of the military, as opposed to the idea of the police, in Western modernity, these are two really distinct realities. The military has to deal with enemies coming from outside. The police has to attend to public order from within the borders of the nation. What I'm suggesting is happening in relation to borders is that borders are no longer just the business of the police. What we see is, or if it is, it's a form of police that is militarized. And the militarization of the police is one key development of one key mechanism through which neoliberalism tries to repress resistance to it nowadays. So that militarization of the police, you see it at work not only at the borders with external countries, but also within internal borders which populate national territories. I have in mind the US once again, in relation to black people. You go to Flint in Missouri, or you go to Detroit, and you look into the ways in which those neighborhoods are policed, and you will see what I mean. You will see attempts at confinement, but from within the same nation state. Or you look into the way the police operates in a city like New York, where those bodies that have been racialized are tracked as they move around the city through technological devices, the list of which would take us a long time to detail. So now you understand what I mean. So part of what is going on has been called by a number of scholars as digital epidermalization. The epiderm. And you see this thing. So it's becoming digital. That racism is becoming digital, which makes it, of course, extremely difficult to fight against. Of course, there are still other forms, primitive forms of racism. A black player in a stadium, and then you have monkey noises and things like that. But even more dramatically, it's becoming technologized, it's becoming digitized, it's now operating through algorithms. Once again, algorithms becoming more and more not only instances of mediation, but executive instances, that they make decisions on our behalf in lieu of ourselves, that we are delegating reason to machines, which was one of the biggest nightmares of someone like Heidegger, to quote apparently infamous authors. So let me now move towards the conclusion. The fact is that as the Earth, the planet, the only one we have, where life is attested, where it's going on, in any case, in the sense we have known it, as it's becoming smaller and smaller, instead of sharing it as equitably as possible, exercising the common possessionality Kant spoke about, instead of all of that, we are moving in an entirely different direction. A new global security regime is in the making. It is characterized by the externalization, the militarization, and the digitalization of borders. It is characterized by an endless segmentation and contraction of rights, including, as I argued at the beginning, the right to knock at the door when in peril. It is characterized by an extension of tracking, of profiling, and surveillance as the privileged mode of mitigating risks. Why is all of this done? Probably it's not because we hate black people or other non-white people. The discourse is we do it as a way of anticipating on risks, preempting risks. We do it in the name of security. But as you know, for those of you who have studied a little bit of modern political history of Europe, what Europe has tried to do may be more than many other parts of the world in its own attempt at living up to its own promise, its own definition. What it has done is that it has always tried to keep a sane balance between the injunction of freedom on the one hand and that of security on the other. The belief being that security cannot trump freedom. And in that sense, it has achieved a lot, at least from within its own boundaries. But that is more and more the paradigm of yesterday. That debate has been closed by now. Security first. Security for which more and more you are asked to exchange your freedom against your security. That is the new paradigm. So that is what is going on. And this, in addition to what I have just said, is paving the way for unprecedented forms of violence, most of which target minorities, most of which target the disenfranchised, and already vulnerable people. It strikes me the demand for brutality in our world right now. The demand to brutalize those who are already vulnerable. It's not a demand to brutalize the structures of oppression. It's not the demand to brutalize capital. It's the desire and the demand to mistreat those who are already on the ground. And this, because critical utopianism is not possible without an ethical judgment on our times, that we make a judgment on the time, this time of ours. The two go together. And if the motive of the trial has to do indeed with a desire to brutalize the most vulnerable among us, then I think a judgment for some of us is quite clear. Now, I want to end it here. I live and work in Africa. I don't live in the place where I was born. I live in South Africa. I am not a citizen of South Africa. But I don't consider myself a stranger in South Africa, or for that matter, in the whole of the continent. Of course, the reality is that since I hold a Cameroonian passport, if I have to go to some African countries, I need a visa. But applying for a visa, getting it, and being able to go, let's say, to the Congo, doesn't make me feel as a foreigner in Africa. Since Africans, or people of African descent, are almost unwelcome everywhere in the world, there's not one single place on earth where Africans arrive and they are welcomed. They are everywhere considered to be there provisionally and to have to go back at one point or the other. This being the case, the utopia for a number of us is to make sure that no African or person of African descent is taken as a stranger on the African continent. That we have one space where nobody asks us, when are you leaving? That is the horizon. And I think that it's a horizon the rest of the human race has to support, because it is in the interest of our species that Africa stands on its own feet. That is the reason why I think deeply, I'm convinced in the bottom of my heart that current European anti-immigration policies, as they relate to the African continent, are anti-human. And I don't need to convoke Kant to demonstrate it. I could bring on board other archives which indeed show the extent to which this is the case. Let me then end all of this. Yesterday, at the museum, we were reflecting on the question of memory and restitution. You know that in a lot of museums in Europe are our objects that we made them, and they were taken away from us through a number of mechanisms, not all of which were violent, by the way, but most of which were defined by one form or another of coercion. So today, in France, for instance, there are 90,000 pieces of art which do not belong to France, in spite of all the juridical explanations concerning the inalienability of that which is public. They don't belong to them. They can bring on board all the laws of the earth. They won't convince anybody that these objects belong to them. They do not. So there's a big debate on restitution, which is a debate that is tricky, because it's happening at a time when the machinery of deportation in Europe is going full steam. So one might want to ask, what is this business of deporting people and sending them back? These are your objects, take them and get out of here. And we do not owe you anything from now on. So it seems to me that if we have to reread Kant in the current conditions, we have to come back to that question of debt and reparation, debt and restitution, debt and justice. Not all forms of debt are expropriatory. In fact, one can make the argument that there is no human community which doesn't have at its foundation one form or another of originary debt. That we owe something to each other. That we do not create the social or the common if we do not believe it, that somewhere, in one way, we owe something to each other. And that the business of democracy is to constantly go back to that which we owe to each other, eliciting it, debating it, in order to preserve the living in common, without which our earth is doomed. And when I say living in common, the living in common in the Kantian sense, the living in common of the human race. So, from this point of view, to restitute is part of an unconditional duty, the duty for truth. Now, this is not about withdrawing into oneself. It's not about allowing oneself to be inhabited by the obsession of one's own place, about being among one's own kind, about a transcendental in itself. This has to do with how we can contribute to the rising of a new region of the world where we will all be welcome, where we will be able to enter unconditionally, where we will all be able to embrace, eyes wide open, the inextricability of the world, its entangled nature and its composite character, in memory of this earth which we share, and in memory of all its inhabitants, humans and non-humans. Thank you very much.